In 1989, the grounds of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo were worth more, on paper, than all the real estate in California combined. Every house, every apartment, every strip mall and skyscraper from San Diego to San Francisco, all of it worth less than one palace garden. Japan wasn't just wealthy, Japan was ascending. They were buying Rockefeller Center. They were buying Columbia Pictures. They were buying Pebble Beach Golf Course. American landmarks, American icons, American symbols of power and prestige, all getting snapped up by Japanese corporations flush with cash. Hollywood was terrified. Wall Street was nervous. Politicians in Washington were talking about a Japanese invasion, not with tanks and planes, but with yen and corporate acquisitions. American workers watched Japanese cars roll off ships and into their neighborhoods while their own factories shuttered. Made in Japan wasn't a joke anymore, it was a threat. Books were written about how to compete with the Japanese management style. Business schools taught Japanese manufacturing techniques. The future, it seemed, belonged to the land of the rising sun, and then it didn't. Within a decade, Japan went from the world's most feared economy to a cautionary tale. The stock market crashed, real estate collapsed, banks failed. The country entered what economists now call the lost decade. Except it wasn't a decade, it was 2 decades, then 3. Japan still hasn't fully recovered from what happened in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So what happened? What turned the world's most dynamic economy into a zombie? Most people, if they know this story at all, think Japan simply overheated. Too much speculation, too much greed. A bubble that grew too big and inevitably popped. Natural market forces doing what they do. But here's the part they don't teach you. Japan's collapse wasn't an accident. It wasn't purely the result of market forces. It started with a secret meeting in a New York hotel. 5 men sitting around a table in September 1985, representing the 5 largest economies in the Western world. They signed an agreement that would fundamentally reshape global currency markets and, whether intentionally or not, set Japan on a path to economic devastation. It was called the Plaza Accord. And if you've never heard of it, that's not an accident either. Let's go back to understand how we got there. Let's go back to the early 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was in the White House and the American economy was in trouble. Inflation had been raging through the 1970s. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, had raised interest rates to unprecedented levels to crush it. We're talking interest rates above 20%. The medicine worked in the sense that inflation came down, but the side effects were brutal. A severe recession, unemployment spiking, factories closing across the industrial heartland. But here's the thing about high interest rates. They don't just affect borrowers and lenders at home, they affect the entire global financial system. When American interest rates are sky high, investors from around the world want to park their money in American banks, American bonds, American assets, because where else can you get returns like that? So money flooded into America, foreign capital poured in, and when foreigners want to invest in America, they need to buy dollars first. They need to convert their yen, their marks, their francs, their pounds into US currency. All that demand pushed the value of the dollar up, way up. Between 1980 and 1985, the dollar appreciated by roughly 50% against other major currencies. It was one of the most dramatic currency surges in modern history. On paper, a strong dollar sounds great. It means American tourists get more bang for their buck in Paris or Tokyo. It means imported goods are cheaper. But for American exporters, for American manufacturers, it was a catastrophe. Think about it from the perspective of a factory owner in Ohio making machine parts. If your product costs $100 and the dollar strengthens by 50% against the yen, your Japanese competitor's equivalent product just got 50% cheaper in America. Meanwhile, your product just got 50% more expensive in Japan. You can't compete. You're being priced out of the market, not because your product is worse, not because your workers are less skilled, but because of currency movements you have no control over. This is what was happening across American industry in the early 1980s. The trade deficit exploded. America was importing far more than it was exporting. Japanese cars, Japanese electronics, Japanese steel, all flooding into American markets because they were so much cheaper than domestic alternatives. American factories were laying off workers. American companies were going bankrupt. And the anger was building. Politicians started calling it an invasion. They talked about unfair Japanese trade practices. Protectionist sentiment was rising. There were literal protests where American workers took sledgehammers to Japanese cars. Congress was threatening massive tariffs. Trade war seemed imminent. But here's where things get interesting. The problem wasn't really that Japan was cheating, though there were certainly trade barriers worth criticizing. The core problem was currency imbalance. The dollar was too strong, the yen was too weak. And that imbalance was created not by Japanese manipulation, but by American monetary policy. The Reagan administration faced a choice. They could let the protectionists win and impose tariffs, risking a trade war that could spiral out of control. They could pressure the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates and weaken the dollar, but that risked reigniting inflation. Or they could try something else. They could intervene directly in currency markets and coordinate with other major economies to bring the dollar down. They chose door number 3, On September 22, 1985, finance ministers and central bank governors from the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom gathered at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. This wasn't a public summit with cameras and press conferences. This was a quiet meeting, carefully orchestrated, designed to produce a specific outcome. The result was the Plaza Accord, an agreement that the dollar was overvalued and needed to come down. The five nations committed to coordinated intervention in currency markets. Their central banks would sell dollars and buy their own currencies, pushing the exchange rates in the desired direction. On paper, it looked harmless. Just some technical adjustments to currency values. International cooperation to smooth out imbalances. Good governance, responsible stewardship. But this is where things get ugly. The Plaza Accord worked. It worked almost too well. The dollar began falling immediately. Within 2 years, it had dropped by more than 50% against the yen. The same currency that had made Japanese imports so cheap in America now made them much more expensive. The trade advantage Japan had enjoyed was evaporating. But here's what the Americans negotiating the accord either didn't anticipate or didn't care about. Japan couldn't just shrug off a currency appreciation of this magnitude. Their entire economic model was built on exports. Cars to electronics, machinery, steel. Japan took in raw materials, added value through manufacturing, and sold finished goods to the world, especially to America. When the yen doubled in value against the dollar, Japanese exports became twice as expensive. Factories that had been humming suddenly faced collapsing order books. The Japanese government faced a crisis. Their export engine was stalling. Growth was slowing, unemployment was rising. They needed to do something to stimulate the economy. And the tool they reached for was monetary policy. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates. From 5% in 1985 down to 2.5% by 1987. Money became cheap, very cheap. Now, when interest rates are low, borrowing is attractive. Businesses borrow to expand, consumers borrow to spend. Banks are eager to lend because they need to put their capital to work. And when there's lots of cheap money sloshing around an economy, it has to go somewhere. In Japan, it went into assets, real estate stocks. The Japanese stock market, the Nikkei, began climbing at an extraordinary rate. Property prices in Tokyo and Osaka started rising at double-digit rates year after year. It was a boom. It felt like prosperity. Everyone was getting richer, at least on paper. But here's the thing about asset bubbles. They're built on borrowed money and borrowed time. The rising prices weren't based on corresponding increases in productivity or profits or actual economic value. They were based on speculation, on the belief that prices would keep rising, on the availability of cheap credit that let people buy assets they couldn't otherwise afford. Japanese banks were lending money like there was no tomorrow. They were lending against real estate as collateral, and since real estate prices kept rising, they kept lending more. Companies were borrowing not to build factories or develop products, but to speculate in the stock market. It was a feedback loop. Cheap money drove up asset prices. Rising asset prices made everyone feel wealthy. Feeling wealthy made people borrow more. More borrowing drove prices up further, and it all traced back to the Plaza Accord. The yen appreciation had forced the Bank of Japan to slash rates. The cheap money had inflated the bubble. The seeds of Japan's destruction had been planted in a New York hotel room. But wait, this gets darker. By 1987, American officials were getting worried. The dollar had fallen too far, too fast. The pendulum had swung too hard in the other direction. Now, American assets were looking cheap to foreign buyers, and there were concerns about inflation and loss of confidence in the dollar. So they convened another meeting, another accord, this time at the Louvre in Paris. The Louvre Accord was essentially the opposite of the Plaza Accord. It was an agreement to stabilize currencies, to stop the dollar's decline. And part of that stabilization required Japan to keep its interest rates low. America didn't want the yen to weaken again, because that would bring back the trade imbalances they had just spent 2 years correcting. So Japan was pressured to maintain easy monetary policy, even as its domestic economy was clearly overheating. Many records suggest that Japanese officials knew they had a problem. They could see the bubble inflating. They understood that asset prices were detached from reality. But they were caught between domestic pressures and international commitments. Raising interest rates would pop the bubble and cause a recession, but it would also strengthen the yen and anger their American allies. So they hesitated. They delayed. They hoped the problem would somehow resolve itself. It didn't. By 1989, the Japanese bubble had reached absurd proportions. The Nikkei stock index peaked at nearly 39,000 points in December of that year. Japanese stocks were trading at price-to-earnings ratios that made no economic sense. Real estate in Tokyo was valued at levels that assumed eternal growth. Golf club memberships were selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. Art prices were skyrocketing, with Japanese buyers paying record sums for impressionist paintings. If you're still with me on this story, and I think this is one of the most important financial stories of the last century, hit that subscribe button. This is the kind of history that explains why the world works the way it does today, and there's so much more to uncover. Let's keep going. In early 1990, the Bank of Japan finally moved. They raised interest rates sharply. The official discount rate went from 2.5% to 6% over the course of about a year. It was too late, and it was too aggressive. The bubble didn't deflate slowly. It popped. The Nikkei crashed. By the end of 1990, it had lost almost 40% of its value. Real estate prices began falling. And unlike a stock, you can't just sell a building at the push of a button. The real estate decline was slower but relentless. Property values in major Japanese cities would eventually fall by 60, 70, 80% from their peaks. But here's what made Japan's crash different from a typical recession. Here's what turned a downturn into a lost generation. The Japanese banking system was sitting on a mountain of bad loans. Banks had lent trillions of yen against real estate collateral. When real estate prices collapsed, that collateral was worth a fraction of the loan value. The loans were underwater. The borrowers couldn't repay. The banks were technically insolvent. In a healthy financial system, bad loans are written off. Banks take their losses. Weak banks fail. Stronger banks absorb them. The system clears, and the economy can start fresh. It's painful, but it's quick. Japan didn't do that. Instead, they engaged in what economists call forbearance. The government and the regulators looked the other way. They let banks pretend the bad loans were still good. They let zombie companies, firms that should have gone bankrupt, keep operating on extended credit. They didn't want to face the social and political costs of mass bankruptcies and unemployment. The result was an economy that never truly healed. The bad debt sat on bank balance sheets like a cancer. Banks couldn't lend because they were weighed down by losses they wouldn't acknowledge. Companies couldn't invest because credit was tight and demand was weak. Consumers didn't spend because their wealth had evaporated and their jobs felt insecure. Japan entered a deflationary spiral. Prices started falling. When prices fall, people delay purchases because things will be cheaper tomorrow. Delayed purchases mean less demand. Less demand means companies cut prices further. Lower prices mean lower profits. Lower profits mean layoffs and wage cuts. Lower wages mean less spending. And round it goes. The government tried to stimulate the economy. They cut interest rates all the way to zero. When that wasn't enough, they engaged in massive deficit spending, roads, bridges, public works projects. Japan built infrastructure it didn't need, creating temporary jobs that evaporated when the projects ended. The national debt exploded. By the mid-2000s, Japan had the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in the developed world, and still the economy refused to revive. Demography made everything worse. Japan's population was aging rapidly. Fewer young workers were entering the labor force. More retirees were drawing on pensions and health care. The tax base was shrinking while expenses were rising. It was a structural trap that no amount of monetary or fiscal policy could escape. Think about what this meant for ordinary Japanese people. A generation came of age in the 1990s that had no memory of the boom times, only the endless stagnation that followed. They're called the lost generation. Young people who graduated into a job market that didn't want them, who faced permanent part-time work instead of the lifetime employment their parents had enjoyed, who delayed marriage and children because they couldn't afford the middle-class life they'd been promised. Birth rates fell, the population began shrinking. Towns and villages emptied out as young people fled to cities that couldn't employ them properly anyway. Japan, which had seemed like the future in 1989, began to look like a warning. And here's the question that haunts this whole story. Was this outcome intentional? Did the Americans who negotiated the Plaza Accord know what they were setting in motion? Did they deliberately aim to cripple a rising competitor? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain. The stated goal of the Plaza Accord was to correct trade imbalances and prevent a protectionist trade war. The American negotiators probably believed they were solving an immediate problem without fully understanding the long-term consequences. Financial systems are complex. Second and third order effects are notoriously difficult to predict. But here's what we do know. The United States had faced a similar situation before. In the 1970s, West Germany and Japan were both rising economic powers. Both threatened American industrial dominance, and in both cases, currency agreements were used to shift competitive advantage back toward the United States. The Nixon shock in 1971, when America unilaterally abandoned the gold standard and devalued the dollar, had similar effects on other economies. There's a pattern here. When America faces economic competition, currency becomes a weapon. Not tariffs, not military threats, currency. Because currency adjustments are quiet. They happen in central bank offices and finance ministry meetings. They're technical and boring. Most people don't understand them. And by the time the effects are felt, it's too late to identify the cause. That's the nature of hegemony. The dominant power doesn't have to force others to comply. They just have to create a system where compliance is the rational choice, where going along with the program is easier than resisting, where the alternatives are all worse. Japan went along with the program. They were a loyal ally. They signed the accords. They played by the rules. And they paid the price. 30 years later, Japan is still paying. The Nikkei index only recently recovered to its 1989 peak, and that's in nominal terms without adjusting for inflation. Real estate prices in Tokyo are still below their bubble highs. The demographic death spiral continues. Japan's population is shrinking by several 100,000 people per year. The country that was going to dominate the 21st century never got there. The Japanese century that seemed inevitable in 1989 simply didn't happen. Instead, Japan became a cautionary tale, a lesson in the fragility of prosperity, a reminder that economic miracles can turn into economic tragedies with terrifying speed. And the really chilling part, most people in the West have already forgotten. If they remember the Plaza Accord at all, it's as a footnote, a technical adjustment in the history of exchange rates. The collapse of Japan is dismissed as inevitable, the result of internal failures, not external pressure. But the people who run the global financial system remember, the central bankers remember, the finance ministers remember. They know how the game is played. They know that currencies are weapons. They know that what happened to Japan could happen to anyone, could happen to Europe, could happen to China, could even, in the right circumstances, happen to America itself. Because here's the final truth that this story reveals. There is no permanent winner in the game of global finance. The rules change, the power shifts, the hunters become the hunted. America used currency manipulation to bring down its competitors. But America is also drowning in debt. The dollar's dominance is not guaranteed forever. Other powers are watching, learning, waiting. In 1985, 5 men sat in a New York hotel and signed a piece of paper. They called it international cooperation. They called it responsible economic management. 30 million Japanese workers call it something else. They call it the day their future was signed away in a language they didn't understand, in a room they weren't invited to, by people they never got to vote against. That's how empires work. That's how they've always worked. The violence happens in boardrooms. The bodies fall in factory towns. And by the time anyone notices the connection, it's already too late. Sleep well tonight. Somewhere, in some conference room, someone is probably signing the next accord. And you won't know about it until the bill comes due.